Recording in progress.
You may be aware that this month's Soul Matters suggested theme is I have a friend who cycled across half of France in one of those crazy bicycle races where you go for 5 days and sleep maybe a couple hours a night just to do this kind of stuff. So are these people that swim the English Channel, I mean, you get the point. It's these superhuman strengths of resilience, and that's what always comes to mind for me, those endurance athletes, when I hear that word. But there's always others as well. We all know people who have been survivors of chronic illnesses, particularly cancer, or just folks that as they've aged, or maybe were even born with chronic pain, and they've had to learn how to cope with that so that they can live a life and manage the pain at the same time. Or think about the resilience physically we all learned just from a pandemic. I think that was a worldwide lesson in resilience. So physical resilience is one, but then I realized there's about 6 others if you think about it. And I'm just going to run through them real quick. Emotional resilience was sort of the next one that I thought about. Coping with that tough stuff in life. Most of us live under a lot of stress, often, most of the time, and I think just learning how to be resilient and work our way through that. Some people recovering from emotional pain. Maybe you've gone through a very hard divorce or separation. Maybe someone close to you has you've lost them, going through the emotional grief and the pain. And we kind of learn in this society, our culture, that regulating emotions is what we are supposed to be doing. We're supposed to keep calm. We're not supposed to have these outbursts. Or maybe that's just this classic upper Midwest stoicism, because we're all descended from British Isles or Scandinavia or Germany, where all that kind of stuff has a tight lid on it. So anyway, emotional resilience is another thing that I thought of. Psychological resilience seems closely related. Mental health. It's the capacity to adapt thinking patterns, maintain perspective, and keep going despite uncertainty or setbacks that happen. And then it got into some of them that I hadn't really thought of as resilience. Collective and relational resilience, this social engagement, the strong ties between family and friends and community that can produce a ton of resilience. In fact, that came to mind because of all the comments about the people of Minneapolis and the resilience they've shown. And I saw one of the broadcasters say, I heard these people are descended from the Vikings. You know, when 50,000 people were out there and it's well below zero. You know, and I thought, yeah, you got it, buddy. Where are you from? But anyway, I lived in Minneapolis for about 20 years. So I just thought about that whole, they've joined together to help out the people that are being picked on and harassed, and doing it in very, very complex ways, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in 2 weeks. Then there's also this one, we don't call it necessarily cultural resilience, but I saw it referred to in an article. It's this shared identity. And think about it. If you're a people or part of a culture, and you, for some reason, left where you are the dominant culture, and then you maintain that culture somewhere else, the diaspora. And there's many, many cultures that have done that throughout history and throughout time. The one that comes to mind mostly, because we're most familiar with it, is Judaism all over the world. And they've kept Judaism alive in remote areas for centuries. And they do it because of this ancestral wisdom that they all share. Storytelling, rituals. It's incredible resilience. And then another one was moral or ethical resilience. Think about that one. Remaining true to one's values despite pressure or injustice. I thought about that one recently because of all the institutions and leaders and people and from Congress and senators that we thought would never cave, but caved into the current racist and fascist upheaval that's going on. Moral and ethical resilience. But I decided, since I'm your spiritual leader and this is a spiritual institution, that perhaps spiritual resilience is the one we should be focusing on today. Hence my title. Spiritual resilience is going to be my theme for two of my messages. This one's more us as an individual, how we do that, and then in more communal the next time. Well, so unpacking what it means embodying resilience. Now I've picked out what resilience, but then the question mark, and I'm sure all of you just had it a second ago, what does spiritual resilience mean to Unitarian Universalists? We tend to think of ourselves as not big on rituals, which tends to be the assumptions that you make when other people are doing spirituality. So I had to think about that as well. Now, I'm the kind of person that the best way to understand what something is to make sure I understand what it's not first. So this is what I came up with. It is not about certainty. It's not about having the right answers. It's not about being calm, comprised, or inspiring at all times. We're not about perfection, right? And it's definitely not about pretending things don't hurt. I think for many of us, resilience has been missold as self-sufficiency. And the first one that comes to mind, I had to chuckle because it's grit. You know, you've got grit, right? And if you recall, somewhere in the last year, I did this sermon on spiritual grit. So now I thought, okay, now I'm contradicting myself here. But if you recall, and if you were at the book group, I think it was November or December we met, it was about a psychological researcher who was asked the question, how can you predict who's going to be successful in life and who's not? Who has, and success defined in any way you want to define it. It wasn't just business or politics or something like that. And she came up with all kinds of things like perseverance and persistence and that, but she said the common thread was that they had hope. That they had hope in the sense that they always thought the next day or next time could be better. The world could become better. They could become better at what they did. They never gave up the hope that something could improve. And they also had the belief that they had agency, the capability to do something about it. And that created this spiritual grit, this hope, this source of hope that made them successful. But today, you know, I hit that term again, grit. Generally, we think of grit as people that's like, pull yourself out by your bootstraps, or, you know, stop crying, kid, suck it up kind of thing. It's kind of this ability to endure without complaining, especially sports teams. I think you hear about it that parents or coaches that are a little out of control, a little excessive with those kind of comments. But all of that version of resilience often leads not to healing, but to exhaustion, because it's usually a standard that most of us cannot ever live up to. And that version of, and so what it's also not about fixing things. And that's where children comes in here. It reminds us of something deceptively simple, that things don't really ever get completely solved. And I know that can sound discouraging because we have this motto that kind of came out of Unitarianism, humanism in the mid-20th century, upward and onward forever. They believed that humans could solve all problems if you just put enough scientific thinking into it. It got a little bit more complicated than that, we learned later. But and so that sounds discouraging to us, I think. But it realizes how much pressure it releases off of us, that we're not out there either as a group or as an individual trying to save the world or save other people or save ourselves alone. So what if the goal of life is not to fix ourselves or the world once and for all, What if the work is not resolution, but relationship? Relationship with change, relationship with loss, relationship with joy, relationship with one another. What if it's all about staying in relationship? Our Unitarian Universalist theology, we often speak of life as a process rather than a destination, of truth as unfolding, not carved in stone, of faith as something we practice, not something we possess. So spiritual resilience, to me, lives right in the middle of those statements, in the willingness to stay in relationship with a life that refuses to be tidy. And then I would think, particularly when the world around us seems to be becoming unhinged at a very fast rate. So how do we do this, right? What is our spiritual practice of resilience, or what's our practice of spiritual resilience, however you want to phrase those words? Well, some of it is right in front of us. It's traditional faith practices, regardless of whether you're Unitarian, Universalist, or something else. Attending services, okay, every Sunday morning or when we've got something going on, think about it. Today was a fabulous day to stay in bed under those covers. But yet all of you are in the room, and some of you got out of bed and got to your computers and are on camera and watching this. So that's a resilience that you've shown right there, and it's a spiritual resilience because you're drawn to community and to a time to just think inwardly. Other obvious ones are prayer, meditation, mindfulness. UUs don't talk a lot about those, especially prayer, but certainly mindfulness and meditation are things we're used to. Some of us are a lot more cerebral. We like to read, we like to study, we like to learn, and we do. And then we bring it and share it with other people. But some of it's really simple. I went through our colorful diagram on the back wall there. It's just simply value-based living. Living with love at the center, right? And remembering all of that. In our reading today, Pema Chodron offers us a different perspective on the practice of spiritual resilience. Making room for all the complexity of life. Interestingly, she calls the spiritual practice a kind of healing. And she says it so simply, with this kind of duality. It's almost a Taoist approach to the way she brings this up. So she says, things falling apart is kind of testing and also a kind of healing. We think the point is to pass the test or overcome the problem, but the truth is that things don't really ever get solved. They come together, they fall apart. They come together again and fall apart again, just like that. And here's the money phrase for her. The healing comes from letting there be room to make all of this happen. Spiritual resilience to make room for grief and relief, for misery and joy. Healing comes from just making room. That is deeply aligned with Unitarian Universalist practice. Every time we light a chalice, it's a ritual that we take for granted, but what it's signaling is, folks, we're going to take the next time period, whether it's our service, a board meeting, a chalice circle, whether you do it at home to meditate. I light it before I sit down to write something like this. That you're saying, this is going to be an intentional period. I'm making room in my crazy, busy life to do something that is not normal in how crazy our lives normally are, right? So every time we light a chalice, think about that. Every time we truly check in with each other. And that I'm so proud of Unitarian Universalists because I've heard this from other congregations that nobody said anything to them when they visited. You see this out in society. You go out and say, hey, how are you? And they'll say, fine. And then you go, okay, great. Then let's go do our transaction of whatever we were there to do, right? Here, for better or for worse, if somebody says, "How are you?" they actually mean it. And they're going to look you in the eyes, and they are making room for you to tell your story, right? And if we're good at it, we don't interrupt them and try to fix whatever they're talking about. We just let there be space. And they're letting us hold it with them, which is a huge gift, which we formalize that ritual when we do our joys and concerns every Sunday morning. And that's why today I wanted to switch it up a little bit to make this point of making space and making room, and see what you think about that. Every time we sing hymns, that's a collective gathering. And I often think we all get hung up on what's the next note, where is this phrase jumping to musically, and we forget that all of these hymns were originally poems that somebody set to music. It's not the other way around, where you have this catchy little tune, you try to find words that fit to it. I'm sure there's some that were written that way. But typically, someone wrote some very beautiful words in a passage, and it was set to music. Or when we sing to the children, I'm glad we sang "This Little Light of Mine." And some of you were holding up your little light like we were taught to when we were little kids, right? You're supposed to make sure you're not hiding it under a bushel and it's out there. I can tell who grew up in those Sunday school classes, right? It's great. So every time we hold silence collectively, or you can do it personally, you're making room, you're opening space for this. So ritual, in this sense, is not a decoration. I grew up in a faith where the liturgy was the same every Sunday all year round, and you kind of mumbled it or sang it, and you just kind of got through it and waited for the next part to get there. And that wasn't creating space, that was just filling space in the way, from my perspective. And so every time we do it, it's not a decoration, it's actually opening the doors a little bit further wide. It's a resilience practice. It creates a container strong enough, hopefully, to hold life's complexity. Now, in addition to that, let's be honest, each of us carries a small handful of life experiences that have quietly shaped our capacity for resilience. Not always the dramatic ones, often the ordinary, painful, formative ones. Maybe a loss that taught us how to grieve without disappearing. I found that phrase, and I just thought that was really cool. Instead of pulling into yourself, withdrawing from the world, you found a way to grieve without disappearing. How about a betrayal? Betrayals are awful. And betrayal that instead you walked away, it clarified your values. Maybe it's whom to trust, who not to trust, that kind of thing. How much you're going to share, how much you're not. But a betrayal that clarified our values. Or a season of depression or doubt that stripped away false certainties. You come to determine what you can trust and what you can't when you go through those kinds of things. It's not that you hope that they never come again. Of course you hope that they never come again. But as Pema Chodron says, they're going to come again. And you find ways to be resilient. Or there's a moment perhaps when you realized you couldn't do it alone and you didn't have to. Someone helped. A community that showed up when we had nothing left to offer. Now, these experiences don't make us invincible, of course, but they teach us something essential. Think about this. You have those moments, I've had this personally, where I'm like, wait a minute, I've been here before. I remember something exactly like this. And at that time, I didn't know how it would turn out, but somehow I'm still here. Somehow I made it through that. So if this feels similar, that's, for me, a source of resilience where I'm like, okay, nothing can be that bad. I can do this time. That knowing is a spiritual resource. Okay, so I've talked a lot about what resilience is, but that word embodying, I'm so glad they put that word in, because typically we're Unitarian Universalists. We like to think about things, we like to debate about it, we like to discuss things, and so in in this case, they finally said, no, it's a physical thing. You have to embody resilience. In other words, feel it, show that you're resilient to the world. So what does that mean? I mean, why would we get to that? And then I thought about this time for all ages that I was preparing for the kids, and I thought, it's that simple. It means living love-centered lives with our Unitarian Universalist shared values. When life feels chaotic and overwhelming, our shared values kind of become that handrail. We may not know what's going to come next in our lives, but we know what matters next, and that's an anchor. Equity and justice matter. Compassion and human dignity always matter. Interdependence and pluralism matter. Transformation matters. Believing in transformation matters. So I always, some of you have heard me repeat this a dozen times. I ask myself and I ask you to ask yourselves, in all these circumstances where you're uncertain, what is the most loving thing to do at that moment? That's living love-centered lives. And you might not like the answer, but it's always, what's the most loving thing to do for others and yourself? Spiritual resilience often means returning again and again to these values, not as slogans, but as guides for how we live when certainty is unavailable. Values don't solve everything, but they sure help us be resilient. So as I've done and mentioned in my first message for the month, I want us to do a communal spiritual practice of sorts. I'm going to close this in kind of the Pema Chodron way, right? So I'm going to invite you in a minute to go into a brief moment of quiet reflection. You can keep your eyes closed, open, whatever you want. There's no rules in this one. And you don't need to share what you come up with anyone. We're not going to have that. I just want you to come up with this and hold it gently. And this is, think of one life experience that has shaped your resilience. Think of one life experience that has shaped your resilience, and don't pick the hardest one necessarily, but the one that's changed you. Notice where you feel it in your body when you're thinking about it. Notice what it perhaps taught you, and maybe notice what it's asking of you now. All this is about is letting there be room for this. So I'm going to use the gong to just ring us in and ring it out. It'll just be a minute, not long, but I just like you to take some time to think about the one life experience that has shaped your resilience. In a world that tells us to be fixed, resolved, and certain, Unitarian Universalist spirituality offers something quieter and braver. The courage to live unfinished lives. The faith to trust the process. The resilience to make room for it all. So may we continue to practice that resilience together, again and again and again. Amen.